So when we start to look at the graph of secant, the secant function, we remember the relationship secant has to cosine. Secant is exactly the same thing as 1 over cosine. So if cosine is 0, then secant is undefined. Now, where is cosine 0? Well, cosine is 0 at all odd multiples of pi. Now, 2n plus 1 just means odd. We have an odd number. So any odd multiple of pi over 2. So secant is undefined at 3 pi over 2, for example, negative 5 pi over 2, 7 pi over 2, any odd number multiplied times pi over 2. Our range, we're familiar with that range, everything except for the space between -1 and 1 for y values. The period is 2 pi, because cosine has a period of 2 pi, and secant repeats itself every 2 pi units just like cosine does. The vertical asymptotes for secant will exist at the odd multiples of pi over 2 where secant is undefined. And since cosine is an even function, then secant is also an even function. To graph secant, we first use cosine as a guide. So here's our cosine function. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the extreme values, the maximum and minimum values of cosine, and that is where cosine is 1 and -1. So if cosine is 1, secant will take the reciprocal of 1, we get 1 again. So everywhere that cosine is 1, secant is also going to be 1. If cosine is -1, the reciprocal of -1 is also -1, so secant will also be -1. So they share those extreme points. If cosine is 0, then secant, well, the reciprocal of 0 is undefined. So everywhere, all of those odd multiples of pi over 2, everywhere that cosine is 0, secant will have an asymptote. So that means secant is undefined at those multiples of pi over 2. If cosine is positive, then secant is also positive. Remember, reciprocal, we keep the same sign. So we're going to make a U-shaped graph that goes in the same direction as cosine. So if cosine is above the x-axis, then secant will also be above the x-axis. And when we draw our U-shaped graph, we get close to that asymptote. So here we're going to have our U-shaped graph going down. If cosine is negative, then secant is also negative, so our graph will go in the opposite direction, going down forever, getting close to the asymptotes. So we'll have our U-shaped graph going up here, and going down, getting close to the asymptotes for each portion of the graph. And the basic shape of secant goes also from 0 to 2 pi. So it looks like this. Very, very similar to the graph of cosecant, except since we're looking at cosine, we're modeling cosine, the graph of secant looks like it's shifted to the left pi over 2 units. So if I wanted to look just at the secant graph, getting rid of the cosine guide that we had dotted in, this is what the secant graph looks like. So that would be the graph of secant.